I also wanted to answer a question or two this evening. The first one that comes to mind is an email that I received yesterday evening. And in it, someone said, well, but isn't the Old Testament loaded with mythology? For example, it speaks about sea monsters and dragons. And surely those are mythological creatures. But I want to reply that isn't actually true. The translators or interpreters are the problem in this case. I believe the word that is used, tanim, or tanim, and I guess plural would be tanimim, tanimim, yeah, like cherubim. Actually, the word tanim is used for whales, for porpoises, and likely was also used for crocodiles. In one case, it's used in the story of Moses and Pharaoh. I believe that's the word that's used for a serpent, when the rod is thrown down and turns into a serpent. And I wonder then if the word isn't based on some understanding of the movement, the way the creature is moving. When it says, thou hast made the Leviathan to sport therein, referring to the sea, and we realize that tanim is the word that's being used, and we realize that, okay, sporting therein is a very good description of porpoises, isn't it? So really, this is what the word means in this case. And also whales were called tanim. So that is an extremely large creature in the sea. And tanim, I can't remember the verse. Perhaps some of you remember where tanim is used to describe the fact that the whale is a mammal, because it says that they nurse their young on their breasts. I can't recall, I think in one of the Psalms. But anyway, the tanim, which is translated as variously as sea monster or dragon. Now the Europeans, in their maps, referred to the Nile alligators, and I think particularly the ones on the upper Nile up in beyond Sudan and all. These huge alligators, or crocodiles rather, were called dragons, and you'll see on medieval maps of that region the inscription very often, "Here be dragons," and it's referring precisely to crocodiles. And I think in the reading where it says that a way will be laid down in the wilderness and no fool will err therein, and the dragons won't nest therein, that really comes to us from a time when there were crocodiles along the Jordan River, and that's precisely what's being talked about. But tanim in general is whales and porpoises. Now, the way that porpoises and whales move in the water, in this undulating motion, which often makes them look like huge serpents. And I think there's a connection between that and the fact that tanim was used in at least one place for serpent. So the translation is, the translators are the problem, not what's actually contained in the scripture, and our understanding of how the words were used. It's like talking about a behemoth. A behemoth, in at least in Slavic languages, is a hippopotamus, a behemoth, or a behemoth. And the idea that some of the early translators, particularly, perhaps in the era of Wycliffe and the King James translation, translated these words and as sea monster or dragon or Leviathan or sign. A Leviathan, of course, is simply something huge, and we understand that refers to a whale, which is quite a huge creature. So I just wanted to dispel these ideas where people don't look in a little bit more depth about what's being said, about what's actually meant, because the translations are very often the problem. And by the way, we have a tanim or a Leviathan going past us right now. If some of you can hear the train whistle blowing from the Canadian Pacific Main Line, which is not too far from the monastery, but on a clear night especially, the horns echo off the mountains behind us. And I suppose we could refer to that as a Leviathan or a Tanim also, in a way, as it slinks and curls down the tracks. But I wonder if, and somebody can perhaps inform me, or us, if they know, if Tanim doesn't somehow come from the curling, undulating motion that serpents made, or that porpoises and whales would make as they dove, out of the water and back under again and played in the water. So that I wanted to answer that one question which had been posed. And there are several other questions, some of which I can't answer. Not that I don't have an answer or know an answer, but there are some things which we cannot discuss honestly and with any integrity, and consequently I refuse to speak about matters where I cannot speak honestly or with integrity. Somebody else had asked about teenagers being stoned to death if they cursed their parents or were disobedient to or disrespectful to their parents, and wasn't that a little savage? In the first place, of course, that would seldom have happened, but the kind of rebelliousness that it's really speaking of would be a situation that would undermine the stability of the society and the tribal structure, particularly at a time when the Hebrews had returned to Canaan and were trying to establish an actual nation. Many of the laws were made in that context and in that premise, that you're a group of, really a confederation of tribes bound together by ancestry to Abraham, and you come through various territories and countries that don't want you there and don't want you passing through, and you come into a land that's occupied, and you're going to occupy it. Nobody really wants you there. Some of the local tribes, as a matter of fact, did ally with Joshua and entered into the faith and into the Jewish nation. But the survival of this tribe, wandering for 40 years in the wilderness, then staying at the area which would become Petra later on, and then going back into a hostile land, required so much more conformity, strictness, and structure than an established nation would require. So many of these laws were given in that context and for that reason. And we see, though, the moderation in the way these things were actually practiced as opposed to the letter of the law. In the law itself, there was always the capacity for negotiating settlements, negotiating a resolution. And I'm told by Jews who are Jewish scholars, not Western people or Christians who are Jewish scholars, that in the actual experiencing of Torah, these laws were never enforced in their strictness. Rather like the canons of the Orthodox Church. By the way, we do not have canon law in the Orthodox Church. We have canons, which are balance beams to help us balance life, or guides, which is what the word means. It doesn't mean law. And I think the Jews used the Torah in a similar way. A balance beam somehow to see how serious something negative was, but at the same time to temper it. And we don't see very many cases of teenagers being stoned to death in the Old Testament, so far as we know. So there was an experiencing of Torah which was moderated by humanity, the humanity of the people, and which God had obviously sanctified and inspired, particularly the prophets, to enjoin people to. We'll discuss the excesses a little later.